really matters? That might be the most important question you can ask. So let's talk about it. Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thanks for joining me here again today for another episode. This is actually the first episode I'm recording after returning from my trip to Portugal. All the previous episodes you've been listening to for 4 or 5 weeks were pre-recorded before I left on that vacation so that I could have a little time before, during, and after to return home and recover from jet lag. So this will be my first opportunity to share with you a few insights that I brought home with me from this trip. And one of the things that I learned while I was in Portugal is historical, and I was very surprised that I had never heard about this event in history before. But the fact that in 1755, the city of Lisbon was devastated and largely destroyed by a massive earthquake. And I had never heard that story before. I got to see a lot of sites that had to do with the earthquake and read some of the history while I was there. And I found it quite fascinating, and particularly that such a consequential event was never included in any of the history courses that I took. So I never knew this earthquake had happened, and yet it is called the first modern global disaster because it had such a worldwide effect. So the earthquake took place on November 1st in the year 1755. November 1st is All Saints' Day. The earthquake happened at 9:40 in the morning when most of the residents of Lisbon were at church celebrating All Saints' Day. The earthquake occurred in the Atlantic Ocean, I think about 50 miles off the coast of southern Portugal. And seismologists who've been able to study the aftermath of that event believe that it was 8.5 to 9 magnitude on the Richter scale, which is huge, massive, one of the worst earthquakes that has ever happened on the planet. The earthquake itself resulted in a huge amount of damage in Lisbon as buildings collapsed, particularly the churches, which is where all the people were housed that morning, with their heavy arches and stone roofs. They collapsed, crushing all the people inside. But the earthquake itself was shortly thereafter followed by a tsunami that was 6 meters high that also wiped out a huge number of people. And there were people who had fled down to the coastline trying to get on boats to escape the damage of the earthquake, who were then wiped out by the tsunami. That was followed by a 5-day firestorm, which occurred because at the time people used candles and live fires for heating in their homes. And as a result of the earthquake itself, many homes caught on fire and it spread rapidly across the city. So there was this triple disaster: the earthquake itself and the damage it caused, the tsunami, and the firestorm. So much of Lisbon was destroyed in the aftermath. I read that 2/3 of the housing in the city was wiped out entirely, and that at least 1/3 of the population was killed by one or the other of these events. Around 50,000 people, they believe, were killed, which again makes this one of the worst natural disasters in history. At the time this earthquake occurred in 1755, Portugal was a global power. Portugal was really one of the first global empires with colonies all around the world, and one of the richest countries in the world because of the colonies that they owned. Portugal was very active in trade around the world and also in maritime exploration, but also involved in the slave trade. So Portugal was one of the countries that gathered up slaves from Africa and sold them to other countries. And we visited sites where we could learn about this very upsetting and distressing part of Portugal's history as well. So this triple disaster, the earthquake, tsunami, and firestorm, occurred at a time when Portugal was really on top of the world in many ways in terms of exploration, wealth, and power. But the entire country was brought to its knees, really, by this disaster. Portugal was a monarchy at the time, but its king had retreated into a rural area where he was living in a tent, basically, and was terrified of being inside a building again after the earthquake. So the king really abdicated his power. And he had a prime minister, the Marquis de Pombal, as he was known at the time, who seized the power and really took charge of rebuilding Lisbon and basically salvaging the country. And I did want to mention that the earthquake affected basically the entire world because tremors were felt as far away as Brazil. In fact, there was damage done in Brazil. And I read that even in Finland and Scotland, there were tremors and flooding that occurred. So the entire world was aware of this disaster, or quickly became aware of what had happened in Portugal. As a result of this disaster, Portugal went from, over time, being one of the wealthiest countries in the world to one of the poorest countries in the world. And rapidly it happened that Portugal's riches were all being used to salvage the country and to rebuild Lisbon. And also some of the diamonds and gold that the country owned were stored in warehouses near the coast that were wiped out and vanished. So literally the country lost its wealth just in a single day, it's just fascinating to think about how change can happen. Such overriding, complete devastation can take place in a single moment, a single incident. And this history just intrigued me so much to learn more about the outcome and what happened because of it. So as I already mentioned, that the Marquis de Pombal took over and took charge of rebuilding Lisbon and really made dramatic progress very quickly. They rebuilt Lisbon on top of the rubble and the ruins that were there. But he really brought Lisbon and the entire country of Portugal into the modern era. And he was very interested in science. Apparently, he sent out questionnaires to people all over the city who had experienced the earthquake itself and asked lots of questions about what they experienced right before the earthquake happened, what the tremors were like, how many people in their area were killed. So he gathered all this data and he and his assistants analyzed it. And he was really the father of modern seismology because of this information that he put together that helped people understand what an earthquake was, what the warning signs were, and what happened across the city as the earthquake shook the city. So he was responsible for gathering this information. And again, this was a really crucial advancement for science. The first time scientific principles were being applied to understand a natural disaster. And this event really coincided with the birth of Enlightenment, and the first time really a rational perspective of the world was coming online and began to be prevalent in societies. So the earthquake not only shook and destroyed physical structures, but it completely brought down some of the old ways of thinking. And imagine this, the timing of this earthquake, that it happened on All Saints' Day while people were in church, and much of the devastation from the earthquake happened in churches. That's where most people were killed who were in church that day. And this was in a society that was, number one, a monarchy, but number two, a theocracy of sorts, where the church had equal power to the king. So the old view of nature and natural disasters was that they were being controlled by God, and that God used these disasters to harm or destroy sinners, people who were living life the wrong way and doing the wrong things. And yet, the majority of people who died in Lisbon on that day were attending church. And it made no sense to any of them how God would destroy the godly, the very people who were in church, worshiping, doing what they were supposed to do, while all the sinful people survived who were outside of church. So the earthquake tore apart some of these old beliefs, religious beliefs that had dominated thinking up until that point. And philosophers got involved in opining on this earthquake in Portugal. Kant, Voltaire, Rousseau, they argued about the fact that it doesn't make sense anymore to utilize a religious explanation for these natural disasters and events that took place. And it was one of the first times in history when there was this breakthrough in thinking suddenly that this event happened because of something inside the earth. It's not a punishment from God. That explanation no longer made sense. And that was a powerful realization that had a ripple effect around the whole world as Enlightenment thinking and as the rational level of consciousness emerged and strengthened around the world. It's just really fascinating that this one event that specifically destroyed one city in Portugal had such a widespread ripple effect that really changed history. That's what some of the historians and sociologists are saying. This event had as much as anything to do with the birth of the Enlightenment and its spread around the world. And some of the ripple effects that happened in a short time after this earthquake were the end of slavery in Portugal. Portugal got out of the slave trade and ended slavery within the country. And that had a ripple effect in the rest of the world as other countries in Europe, as we know it now, also ended slavery. Some historians think this earthquake and its aftermath accelerated the battle for independence in the U.S. They know that it accelerated the French Revolution, which was a rebellion against monarchy and theocracy. It called into question the power of the church and the power of monarchs, and elevated in our thinking the power of nature and a desire to understand how the natural world works using science. So modern thinking was really strengthened after this event. And then modern thinking about architecture and building safe structures that could withstand natural events, disaster planning, and as I already mentioned, seismology. Those were born really because of this earthquake in Lisbon. So again, I found it fascinating, and I've been thinking about it for ever since we were there. The things that we saw a ruined church that was left standing so that people could always understand the event and the devastation from that earthquake. I saw another church that remained standing but had burned and scarred pillars inside from the fire that swept through. And so it's a fascinating part of the history of Portugal to learn about. And again, it resonated with me because of one of the things I've talked about before, is that suffering is the path to transformation. And that was one of the lessons from the Tao that I talked about a few weeks ago. And this was such a good illustration of the fact that evolution and transcendence can come about after a horrific catastrophe. And in no way does that make the catastrophe a good thing or acceptable. I'm not saying that. In no way does it lessen the pain of the loss that occurred from the catastrophe. But there is a seed of hope within every catastrophe when we know that transformation, growth, and new growth in particular are possible after such devastation occurs. And right now, as I record this, in our current times, we're watching a horrific war unfold in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas. And the stories that we're hearing are absolutely devastating and crushing. It's so upsetting to be here watching this destruction happening, seeing so many lives destroyed, seeing so many people in pain, in fear and terror, and also dealing with the uncertainty of how could this escalate? What may come of this? What may happen next? All of us are in this place of experiencing the pain as we're witnessing what's happening with absolutely no means of assisting, no means of changing anything. We can just be here seeing it unfolding. And it's horrific, and it's a terrible thing. In no way do I mean to diminish any of that by saying that there is within me a tiny bit of hope or light or grace, I guess, that says I understand that from the worst things that can happen, something new can be born. And I understand it because it's happened over and over again throughout history. And I understand it because we humans have created myths that examine this very phenomenon, like the phoenix rising from the ashes, the idea of a bird that destroys itself with fire at the end of its life and then rises anew from the ashes. These images and these myths that persist throughout history occur because there is a seed of truth in this. There is this possibility always there when we have gone through the most horrific, worst of times, that some sort of transformation or transcendence can be in process, can actually be occurring at the same time. And I don't mean that should comfort us. I think we have to embrace where we are with our fear and the pain and the horror that we're witnessing. We have to stay where we are and not look for a way to be comforted or a way to move into some positive thinking zone about it. We have to hold all the pain and hold the suffering, even while we know transformation is possible. Do we know for sure it will happen? No, we don't. We only know that it's possible, that the seed exists within every tragedy for some sort of transformation to occur. We know the seed is there, but will it occur? We don't know that yet. And so we can't really be focusing on that, but there is a tiny light that emerges in the darkness of this situation that says, historically, over time, over and over again, it has happened. It has happened that there is transformation possible when we go through the worst of times. And so those two realities, this historical information about Portugal and the current information of what's happening in Israel and Gaza, are really on my mind this week. And that's all coming together. And I'm reminded of it again because just last week, I was visiting with a hospice in the state of Washington, made some home visits with the nurses, and saw a patient there who was very close to dying, but who had the tattoo of a phoenix on her chest because she loved the image of a phoenix rising from the ashes. And this woman was experiencing some fear of dying and some reluctance to die, fear that she would be punished, that she wasn't a good enough person or hadn't lived her life well enough. And it all came around somehow full circle that she had this phoenix on her chest for a reason. And she told me that once before she had almost died, was very, very sick and had almost died, but recovered. And that she saw herself as the phoenix. And so I just talked to her about that a little bit, and I guess in a way to reassure her that you are the phoenix. You are the phoenix, and you will rise, maybe not in this body again, maybe not in this life, but you are the phoenix, and you are able to rise from the ashes. And that was really the message that I wanted to get through to her, to take away some of her fear of dying, to use her own image that was important and powerful to her. And I hope that we can hold on to images like that for ourselves, because if anything, we need a reason to carry on and to continue. We don't need to take away our pain, but we need to see enough light in any situation that we can find a reason to keep going wherever we are, that we can find a reason to wake up every day and to continue, and also to continue to love, a reason to stay in a state of love as much as possible. If there's anything that we could do that could be helpful in the current situation around the world, it is, as much as possible, when we witness these stories, when we hear about all the anger and hatred and pain and violence and suffering, that we remain with open hearts of love. We hold all this information, we hold space for it, we keep our hearts open, and we find the ability to carry the pain without sinking ourselves into despair or anger or hatred. Do we find a way to remain in a state of love and without denying any of the pain, carrying that pain, witnessing it, experiencing it, but at the same time surrounding it with our own love. And I feel like that's the only way we get through this. We get through this by trying to be loving together. And that is the way we can actually make a difference, because if we can stay calm and we can continue to generate and radiate a loving presence and loving energy out into the world, we're helping to diffuse some of the anger and fear and hatred that is being spewed out everywhere around us. So for me, I'm focusing on that. I'm thinking about the earthquake. I'm thinking about transformation that is possible and transcendence that is possible, though not guaranteed. I'm thinking about the fact that continuing to love and returning always, always, always to my calm place where I can open my heart and just love. That is the thing I can do, and the most important thing for me that I must do right now in this moment as we're going through this very painful and challenging time. So that's what I felt like talking about today, and I'll be back next week with some more thoughts for you. Until then, remember that we're here for love. That is the most important thing we can ever focus on. So face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings you next, and love each and every moment of this very existence. Bye-bye.